One of the first things that I really wanted to figure out for the new stylized look of Heroes of Bronze was how to make water and ocean surfaces directly in Blender. And in this tutorial, I will show you exactly how I do it using the shader editor and almost no textures. So let's start with a simple plane. Scale it to about 1000 meters. You will see it in this shelf menu here, and you can go up to 1000. That will be enough scale for us to work with. You can also solve the clipping by increasing this end distance here. And now make sure that you apply all the transforms with Ctrl A. Hit Tab, Subdivide, and 100 will be probably enough for the number of cuts. Alright, with that, let's switch to Shader Editor. And create a new material here, call it Ocean. And we'll go from there. Let me switch to the rendered preview here and add a new sun lamp that shines from the top. Then reselect our ocean and we can safely delete this principal BSDF. We will not be using it. So first node that we will plug in here is the gradient texture. Let's just plug it into the surface directly and see how it looks. And with Ctrl T, if you have the Node Wrangler add-on activated, you can then add these two nodes that will allow us to manipulate with this gradient texture. To color this gradient, let me plug in a color ramp, which is one of my favorite nodes. And here we can play with the color. At one end we have the black color, so let's make it brighter and kind of cyan in here. And then find the blue color for the other side. Make it a little darker. And we have this linear gradient coming from left to right. In the real world, the brighter colors are for areas that are closer to the coast, where for example there is sand underneath the water, and the deeper blues are for deeper oceans. And we can in fact make this one a little bit brighter, for example like this. And then we can push this a little bit closer to the edge so that the coastal area is not so wide. And right here in the interpolation option you can ease in the transition so that it's even softer. Something like this. This is a good base for our ocean. The gradient is now a little bit too regular for my taste, so let's break it up with some new colors here. Let's add a noise texture, and with Ctrl-Shift-Click let's preview it. And now again we can input some color ramp. Bring these points together like this to increase the contrast. And we can even with Ctrl-T add these mapping nodes here. One thing that I like to do is to add a new empty into the scene. Leave it for example in the middle, and then in this texture coordinate just specify this empty as the source of our coordinates. And you also have to switch to this object mode here. And now this empty will drive the size and position of this noise node. So this is great if you really want to have a manual control over these textures. Now the empty is too big for my taste, so in this menu over here, you can just decrease the size. And if you like, you can even change this to something like a sphere. Or not. Now going back to the ocean, you can use this texture however you like. For example, as shadows on the ocean plane, or as some sort of breakup of the colors. Let me actually hold Ctrl-Shift, right mouse button drag, and that will quickly combine these two, the gradient texture and the noise texture, with a mix node into one unified texture. And here we can choose, for example, the multiply mode to darken these areas. And that can result in a shadow looking texture on the surface of the ocean. Or you can change it to overlay, lower this intensity, and that will just break up a little bit the regular nature of the gradient. The choice is up to you. You can also do both by mixing in another mix node here, but in my case, let's actually go for multiply, increase it a little bit, and thus we can simulate shadows by making them move around. We actually have this empty here, so instead of animating the mapping node in the shader editor, we always have this empty that we can just keyframe to move around and simulate shadows gliding over the surface of our ocean. I really like this handy way of animating my textures. What I really like to do is to switch my noise textures into 4D type. And here you can see that there is this new W option, which kinda allows you to animate the evolution of the noise texture. And if you do it very softly, it can make it feel like the cloud shadows or the clouds above the ocean are changing a little bit with the wind. So let me actually add a new window in here. Let's hide the shelf with N. Go to Graph Editor. Select the ocean and then select this noise texture. And right click, Insert Keyframe. Right away you can see that this noise option appeared in the graph editor, and if you hit N, switch to modifiers, and choose this generator, you will generate a rising value, which is too fast at this point, but it's just a matter of lowering this number over here. For example, let's try 0.02. And that's much better, but still a little bit too fast for clouds, so let's lower it even more. And now the clouds are evolving nice and slow, and this really randomizes the final result. And while we're at it, we can take the empty, and as mentioned, we can now animate it. So let's go to the start of the timeline, insert keyframe here, and go to the end. And make it go up on the X like this. Add another keyframe, we can hide the shelf to open up some space. Normalize so that we see the whole curve. And instead of having it speed up and then slow down, let's make it a linear movement. And now the clouds are gliding over the surface of the ocean. It may be a little bit too fast though. So let's actually push this keyframe on X like this. And now they're moving much slower. Cool, this is how I usually make my oceans a little bit livelier with some sort of secondary animation there. Let's reselect our ocean. And with this, we can select all our nodes that we've already added and join them in a new frame. Name it Ocean Base. Add some color. For example, we can sample the color of the ocean here and increase the label size as well. Let's hide the graph editor for now so that we have more space in here. And congratulations, we have the first part of our ocean done. If at this point you want to have the option to paint different colors on the surface of your ocean, let me just hide this multiply with M. And now what we can do is to add a new mix color node in here and an attribute node with color that we plug in here. Now we need to source something in here. So for that, go to Data tab, Color Attributes, and make a new color attribute in here. Name it blue, for example. And with this blue attribute selected, go to Vertex Paint, switch to Shaded Mode so that we see it better. And in here, it's important that you have this white color selected, because we will be painting white color onto our surface. You can blur it a little bit with this option. And now, if we type in blue into this attribute node, switch back to object mode and render preview, whatever we have painted onto our new blue map is now white. But that's just because here we have the white color. So all we have to do is to sample, for example, this bluish. And with this setup, at any point you can go back to the Vertex Paint and paint any area in here, blur it, or if you want to get rid of it, just switch from this white color by hitting X, and that will function as an eraser. Hit X again to add white, then blur it, and this allows you to break up the gradient manually. Let's reactivate our shadows. And looking at this, we can actually make them a little bit less intense. Of course, it goes without saying that you can always change this color to something different to break up the uniformity of your ocean. Alright, so what do we have here at this point? We have some evolving shadows gliding over the surface, we have a gradient, and we can always break up that gradient with various colors that we manually paint. Now, all we have to do to finish up this ocean is to add little glints on the surface that simulate the highlights on the waves. Let's start these glints with a completely new texture, which will be a Voronoi texture. Let's Ctrl-Shift-click it to preview it, and right off the bat, we can add a color ramp again and increase the contrast like this. This has created this sort of shapes, but that's not completely what we're going for. So let's go up with the scale and randomization a bit lower to something like 0.7 so that the texture is not that uniform. This will be much more apparent when we increase the scale in here like this, and this very much depends on the size of the ocean that you're gonna make, but for example 30 for the X value and 150 for the Y value. And you can now see that we have created these glints, and if you want to have them going the other way, just flip these values, so 30 for Y and 150 for X, and now you can see that the little glints are stretched in the Y direction. And we can in fact stretch it even higher to something like 300. This is in fact a good rule of thumb to take the base value and duplicate it by 10 on the side where you want it stretched. Right now there's lots of glints, so let's go a little bit higher with the contrast here. And by the way, you can then always decrease the scale in here if you want to make the glints texture scale larger. So for example, let's go with 5. This looks good. And again, we can immediately switch to 4D and animate this value over here. So you know the drill, go back to the graph editor in here and insert keyframe into the W value. And in the shelf here, generator, and again 0.002. Cool, and now the glints are evolving. Now all we have to do is to go back to the shader editor and combine these two things together, so our ocean base with the glints. So let's take this last node over here, the multiply node, and Ctrl-Shift-Drag together with this color ramp. And now there's various ways that you can combine this together, but in this case I would like to choose this screen option. And since I want my glints to go over the ocean base, I will in fact switch these. So let's put the glints into the B socket and the base into A socket. And with this, we've added the glints onto the surface of our ocean. You can increase the factor here to make them more visible. So let's go the whole way with factor 1. And now when we hit play, yes, we've added some nice glints to our ocean surface. Now one last thing we can do is if we have a look at the glints and make some more of them in the color ramp, the texture is spread out a little bit too uniformly. And I want to poke holes into these glint areas over here. So for that, let me add another noise texture. Let's do the same thing that we've done previously. So add in the mapping and texture coordinates and also a color ramp. Plug the color into the color ramp and Ctrl-Shift-Click preview it. And now just increase the contrasts again. And I think this is in fact okay. We don't have to go overboard with these settings here. We will not even use the 4D option. This will be just a simple texture which we will combine with our glints here. So let's select the color ramp of the glints and Ctrl-Shift right mouse button drag over this new color ramp. Ctrl-Shift-Click preview it. And right now we can try hitting the multiply. That does nothing. So let's just increase the factor to 1. And you can see we've achieved poking holes into the glint areas over here with this new noise texture. You can play with the contrast a little bit to completely get rid of the glints. So increasing the contrast in here will achieve that. And now when we plug back in our final screen node, it will result in this. This may be a little bit too empty, so let's go back to the color ramp of the new noise texture and reintroduce some of the little glints back in. Alright, so we've combined our ocean shader with some moving glints, and you can also select your glints and add them into a new frame. Call it Glint, of course. Give it another color, something brighter, for example. And this way we are done with our ocean. One last issue to address is that our ocean doesn't really cast any shadows when I place object here. There should be a rectangular shadow on this surface right now, but there's nothing. And that's because we haven't added any shaders in here. All we have is this last add node, add mix node, that plugs the color directly into the surface of our object. And there is no shading information about how the surface should behave. So if you want your shadows, and at this point I'm sure there is some proper technical solution, but in my case I just like to use a diffuse shader over here, and that added our shadows, but it also darkened our surface of the ocean significantly. So first, let's increase roughness so that we have no reflections on this, because this stylized style doesn't need reflections. And also let's add an RGB curves node, increase the brightness here and decrease a little bit of the darker points of the curve. And now if we have a look at how the original texture looked and how it looks now, it's a little darker still, so we can go a little brighter in here. I think the difference is negligible. And we have our shadows here. So yeah, that's all we needed. Now let me show you how you can very quickly add a boat wake and foam to the objects that are floating on top of your ocean. I have this animated flowing ocean here, a variation on the shader that we just made. And by the way, this file, along with dozens of others, you can get on my Patreon. So first off, make a grease pencil object and make a white material on it. Then in the draw mode, simply draw a few lines on the surface of the water using this surface drawing mode. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be somewhat on the intersection between the boat and the water line. And now on this grease pencil object, let's add a noise modifier where we increase the thickness and decrease the position noise. And already you can see the lines are animating, looking like this sort of stylized boat wake. However, we can do more. I like to add a few more modifiers on my grease pencil object here. First, thickness to be able to control the weight of the lines, then opacity to make them fully opaque, and finally a shrink wrap to make them stick to the water surface. You will probably have to reposition the grease pencil slightly below the water line for the lines to stick to it, and then raise this offset to make them appear again, but this time really copying the surface shape. This looks good, though I think we could increase the noise scale and also the random timing here. Let's lower this value to every second frame, and now it's really looking like an animated foam rather than just squiggly lines. And that, my friends, is how I made the majority of my water surfaces and animated water lines for my stylized shots. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, consider supporting my efforts over at Patreon, where I share a lot more in-depth exclusive tutorials. And you can also subscribe for free, and that way you will get a monthly newsletter on various topics connected to my project. Until next time, stay creative, my friends. Martin out.